everybody, so today I thought we would read All the Broken Places, which is the long-awaited sequel to The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, which, as you may remember, I did not review in the most positive way. Yeah, that book is a bit of a disaster, but every book is different, so maybe this one will be the book that changes everything. This time, All the Broken Places is about Gretel, who is Bruno's older sister. Except now it's the present day and she's living in London, but she is still haunted by her past. So having to flick through this book a little bit, it seems like half of it takes place in the past in the 1940s and half of it is taking place in the present day, which I think could be a good thing because, as we have already established, John Boyne's historical research isn't always the best. All I'm saying is that if the characters suddenly start making jam with sweet flowers and sunsetia fruits, then we'll know what happened. But despite all my criticisms, I'm still going into this with an open mind, and I'm fully willing to allow it to surprise me for the better. So let's get started reading the book. Oh my god. First of all, a big warning for sexual violence, which I was not expecting in any way. So basically the premise of this book is that Gretel is now an elderly lady living in this multi-million-pound apartments complex in London. Nice for her. Anyway, so she has spent all of her life hiding her past and everything that's happened to her. And her greatest fear is someone finding out what happened when she was a child. But at 91, she seems like it's all good. She's managed to evade anyone recognizing her. She has some new neighbours moving into the apartment below her, and she's very curious to find out what they'll be like. Until she finds out one of them is a 9-year-old child. And she hates 9-year-old children specifically and avoids them at all costs because of what happened when she was a girl with Bruno. To the extent that when her son was 9, she had a mental breakdown and spent the whole of that year in hospital. But so far, it seems that this family, something up with them, not in a good way. The dad is like this big Hollywood film producer, but he seems like a terrible guy, and I haven't even met him in the story yet, so we'll see where that goes. Probably not in a good direction, to be honest. Between all the chapters about like the modern day neighborhood antics that are happening, there are these chapters that take place in 1946, I think. This is basically when Gretel and her mum have taken on new identities, they've escaped Germany, and now they're living in Paris trying to sort of rebuild everything that's happened. And the way that the mum is trying to do that is to try and marry a sort of high society guy so they can just go back to how things were before, but Paris instead. And the way Gretel is trying to do that is to get in with this shopkeeper guy so that she can just elope with him and run away from her mum. So that seems like a flawless plan for both of them. I'm sure nothing will go wrong here. But very quickly it does go wrong. The whole town realises who they are and trauma is happening. Only 100 pages in. So the main themes that we're getting so far is about trying to forget the past, but the past is still affecting you now. So modern day Gretel has no pictures except the ones that she feels compelled to display, like her son's graduation. But other than that, basically nothing. And in the past, young Gretel is pretty occupied by the question of whether she and her mum are guilty as well by what happened. So it seems like the mum is doubling down on the viewpoint from the war, even more so than how she felt at the time for some reason. Along with one of the central concerns of the book being about living a life of regret and guilt, there's also this central question about childhood innocence and whether Gretel and her mum were responsible for what happened. And not sure what John Boyne is going to do with this question yet, obviously, but do see a few seeds that could not be the best, so I hope they don't grow. So basically, it seems a little bit like we have this comparison with the past and the present, where it's trying to say that you shouldn't judge people for their past, you shouldn't try and police everybody's language. Basically, there's this one line from the 1940s chapters where it says, "A single word, collaborator, now incited the same levels of terror in the populace as another aristocrat had done in a century and a half earlier." And then there's a little section where the modern day Gretel is thinking, "It seemed to me that language was being torn asunder these days, with the most basic words being discarded as offensive. It seems that the safest thing was not to speak at all, in which case perhaps the world had not changed very much at all." I'm seeing a connection being drawn here. Seems to be comparing that to people in the modern day who are sort of saying what the new things are to say, what things you shouldn't say, excluding people for saying the wrong thing. And so for context, Gretel is saying this because an interior designer has described the room as the word space rather than the word room, which Gretel would say. Does anyone think these two things they're not equal, okay? Like Gretel, you can just say the word room, and the interior designer lady, she can just say the word space. Everyone's happy. Do you know what's not happy? War criminals being in your community. I hope this trend doesn't continue, because otherwise this book might turn into a discussion about something else, which it really shouldn't be. We'll see how it goes. It does seem like each part is like set in a different country, like a different place where Gretel has been throughout her life. So next we're going to Sydney, which is quite exciting. So let's hope nothing too traumatic happens there as well. I'm sure it will. Okay, so it has been a little while since I last picked up the book, but the reading vlog continues. And so has Gretel's life in London, where she is learning more about the family who live next door to her. And building on what has just happened in the first part, it seems like this is not a very nice household. So the mum gets so drunk that she forgets to pick up her kid from school. So that becomes Gretel's job. She has to go and pick him up from school at 91 years old, can barely walk down the road. And this is when Gretel sort of befriends the kid and realizes that he is a carbon copy basically of Bruno. He loves the same books as him, he's the same age. It does remind her of Bruno, but she isn't super apprehensive. She isn't running away from this. Instead, she's more befriending the kid. And we also learn a bit more about the parents. So the dad is like the classic abusive parent towards the mum and the kid, which explains the drunken behaviour and forgetting to pick him up from school. So it does seem like what is going on here is that we're heading towards Gretel saving the kid from this family somehow, and this being like a redemption for what happened in her past. But the main story in this part has been happening all in Australia, where Gretel has moved to restart her life again. And it seems to be going well. She's working in a shop, she's living with her new best friend, everything seems to be going okay until someone from her past turns up. none other than the guy that she had a crush on as a 12-year-old child, who is currently also escaping to Australia, living a nice, boring life as a banker with his wife and his kid. And Gretel's reaction to this development is to kidnap his 5-year-old child and then plan to kill him and herself. Luckily, she does not succeed in any of this, and instead she meets up with the dad in a cafe and they have this really interesting conversation. I'd say this is the most interesting thing that's happened in the book so far. So what we're seeing is that Coulter seems to have no remorse for what happened. The only thing he regrets is that they lost the war. And then he's talking to Gretel, who's having all of these sort of conflicting emotions where she's thinking, oh, I'm completely innocent in this, I was only a child, but also she's thinking, maybe I was responsible. And then they have this conversation about sort of how much people would have known, how much people were responsible. This conversation sort of seems to be filling in the plot holes and addressing some of the criticisms towards the boy in the striped pajamas. It's sort of explaining why Shmuel was even still alive at this point. It's also addressing how much anyone would have known. And I think it's quite long-awaited in these books that we finally get the perspective of one of the perpetrators, who's like laying out their brutal but probably realistic opinions about what happened. And I'm thinking maybe something like this was missing from The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. So in The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, the first book, you kind of just have Bruno being innocent, almost romanticizing what was happened by saying, oh, they're all just wearing pajamas and things like that. And maybe it would have been good to sort of have a bit of the contrast with, addressing a character who is fully in the beliefs and this being presented to the reader a bit more explicitly, like what's happening in this book now. It kind of grounds you a bit more into the historical reality rather than leaning into the fable stuff of Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. But that said, this conversation is 2 chapters long. It's not a big part of the book, and we still have like 100 pages left. Gretel is now moving to London to restart her life again. And it seems like we're going to sort of get the conclusion of what's going to happen with the kid who lives next door. Will Gretel be able to save him from the abusive situation? Will she finally come to terms with what happened? Will she forgive herself for her role in it? I don't know. We'll have to find out. Okay, it's the evening now, and I've finished all the broken places. And I have 2 words for it, and that is frustrating and bemusing. So we left off where Gretel was coming back to England to sort of restart her whole new life in London, where she's very lucky enough to find not 1, but 2 love interests. And this is like the first time in the book where Gretel is actually coming across survivors. So rather than being able to hide from everything, she has to sort of directly confront her past psychologically. So first there's someone who she works with who she finds out has, the tattoos, and when she sees them, she's very distressed, more for herself than her co-worker, which isn't surprising at this point, to be honest. And then, plot twist, her love interest number 1, he is also a survivor. While half of his family died, and him and the rest of his family got to England instead. And he's very angry about what happened, understandably. And when he finds out that the girl he's been dating was the daughter of a Nazi commander, he is very angry about this. He's like, he doesn't want to speak to her anymore, he doesn't want to be with her, he wants nothing to do with her, and he feels extremely betrayed that he was with her for so long. But the problem with this scene is that it is constructed sympathetically towards Gretel. It's like, oh yeah, she had like such a terrible time, being left by this guy pregnant. Adding to this is the fact that Gretel didn't know about his past. Like, for all of their relationship, they didn't know very much about each other, to be honest. When she tells him the full truth and he tells her the full truth, he's the one with the big reaction that, is leaving her alone with a baby on the way. Again, it doesn't really surprise me, that whole situation. Anyway, so then love interest 1 has gone away very angrily, but not to worry, love interest 2 is there to look after Gretel, and so she gives the baby away for adoption, but then quickly becomes pregnant again. and has her son, who we've met earlier on in the book. And another plot twist, her first baby, who went up for adoption, is now living across her in her house, which is a coincidence. Maybe I missed it, but it was not explained how they ended up in the same building. I don't know. I feel like it was just there to be like, oh, isn't Gretel nice for looking after her neighbour with dementia who's actually her daughter? I don't know. I don't know why it was there, to be honest. That's kind of it for all of the 1950s plot. Kind of stops there. Apparently nothing interesting happened to Gretel for like 70 years. Now the juicy stuff is in the modern day plot. So as we know, we have the family next door with the kid and the mum who are being abused by the dad. And so Gretel decides that she's going to go to the police about this when she realises that there is physical violence involved. Predictably, the police do absolutely nothing. So Gretel decides to take things into her own hands, and she does this by stabbing the guy in the neck and then dragging him away to her spare bedroom at 92 years old. It feels like most of this book could be written for children. It's quite simplistic, but then John Boyne's like, no, this is actually an adult book. So he just throws in assault and murder. The way that I thought this book was going was that Gretel would actually, admit to her past, tell the truth, and that would be her redemption, not her murdering a man. Because you see, the abusive father, he tracked down all of her details. He knew exactly what her past was. And he said, well, if you go to the police about me, then I will go to the papers about you. I thought that the way this was going, Gretel would be like, yeah, go to the papers about me. Whatever. It's more important that I save your child from your abuse. And then it would be like, Gretel admitting to her past, confronting it, telling her story, finally, owning up, taking accountability, in the process saving the kid in the way she couldn't save her brother. But that's not what happens. Instead, she goes to prison for murder and still does not tell anybody her story or the truth. And I'm like, why? That's the ending. What? We spent 300 pages building up to this. And I guess the question is, what do you have to do to redeem yourself? What does it mean to sort of take accountability? But I feel like murder is just such a heavy-handed way to do that. It's like, was Gretel justified in murdering this man to save his wife and child from him? And does that make up for what she didn't do as a child? It is an ending. That is all I will say. It is a book that has an ending. So now we've covered the whole plot, let's sort of get into my notes and analysis. My first one is that All the Broken Places basically does the same things as The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, reiterating the same sort of tropes, the same stuff that people criticize the first one about. So John Boyne has tried to address some criticisms, I feel like Shmuel, he turns up about halfway through the book in a flashback, and literally, it seemed to me, all he was there for was to explain his presence in the first book, to sort of address the criticism of the historical inaccuracies that have been directed towards John Boyne. He wanted to be like, see, this is why Shmuel was there, this is why he was allowed to be alive, this is why he was wandering around. Again, in All the Broken Places, the sympathy is for the perpetrators and not for the survivors. Throughout the book, Gretel seems to be more traumatized by Bruno's death, her brother's, than sort of the knowledge of what happened. She's scared of fences. She goes to the mental hospital because her son disappears behind a fence. And it's like, that's the traumatizing thing. And I'm like, yeah, it makes sense, to be honest, reading the first book, because that is the traumatizing thing that happens. And again, the sympathy is for the perpetrators, not to the victims. It's literally the same thing is happening. And it sort of seems like the only time Gretel feels any lasting effects is when the violence, took place in her own home. There's that scene where she sees someone like get kicked to death. When it's her own home, that's when it's traumatizing, not the knowledge of what happened next to where she lived. You see in a flashback, she visits the camp, and there's no flashbacks to and the trauma to what she saw, the sort of the people, what they look like, the things that she saw happen. It's like that's not the traumatizing part. What's the point of even writing this book if you're not going to address that aspect? And again, as I mentioned before, like the sympathy is with Gretel when her Jewish partner leaves her, rather than for him and sort of what he's been through, what his family has been through. It's like he's kind of painted as a bad guy because he leaves her. There is like a moral dilemma, but because you're in Gretel's perspective, you're kind of forced to be on her side, forced to think that he's in the wrong, and she's been put through a bad thing. And again, this book, despite being technically a different genre, a different audience, this isn't a book for adults. It's not a fable, allegedly, like the first one, but it still uses the same language that kind of lacks detail, the way it kind of evades the real words for things. So for example, we don't hear the proper nouns for things. So Gretel calls it that other place, similar to how Bruno calls it out with. She also doesn't say Bruno's name throughout the whole book until the end. Gretel even, as a 91-year-old woman, calls the uniforms the pyjamas. It's still got this sort of romanticized, evasive kind of tone, and like it kind of worked in the first one because it was sort of part of the childhood innocence theme, but we don't have that theme anymore because Gretel is in her 90s, like she's not a child anymore. So it just kind of seems like it's being kind of evasive and it's a bit out of place. It seemed like an excuse not to sort of get into the nitty-gritty of the history, just to sort of slide past it and to get on with I don't know, the murder apparently. And then this brings me to my sort of final point, which honestly I feel like is the most sort of concerning of them all, which is that this book kind of feels like it was written in response to what John Boyne was doing on the internet in 2020, which is not a great thing for your historical novel, which is based on like a very traumatic part of modern history. John Boyne has said that he was planning to write this book as like his final book. When he sort of run out of other creative ideas, he was going to write this one. It would be like, this is the end of it. But then he decided during lockdown, instead he was going to write the book now. Supposedly this is, so it would be a contemporary novel and Gretel would still be able to be alive because of maths. But honestly, the general feel, like I mentioned this earlier on, it kind of seems like it's in response to the sort of Twitter battles he got himself into. If you remember from my Boy in the Striped Pyjamas video, go into more detail about this stuff there. So for example, he joined a bunch of authors, the usual suspects, who signed this sort of free speech document because, as best-selling authors, their voices and opinions are being suppressed. Never mind the big problems that publishing has in introducing new voices. No. The real problem here is that John Boyne got criticised by a museum about his book. That's the real censorship happening. Like the way the themes are set out, where it's like when you've been involved in something bad, like when you may have done something wrong, and when it's about guilt and accountability, like I don't know, I'm just seeing a connection there, okay? And then some of the comments throughout about how people nowadays kind of don't allow people to have their own opinions, and the sort of comparison between that and the Nazis, like it's not great, is it? And then, of course, the author's note is very revealing. Not surprising at all, but it's good to sort of have John Boyne's thought process confirmed. In the author's note, he's continuing to insist that historical fiction has no reason or responsibility to educate, Instead, it's only to sort of say emotional truths. There's a lot to unpack there. Any novelist approaching the topic of the Holocaust takes on an enormous burden of responsibility. Not the burden of education, which is the task of non-fiction, but the burden of exploring emotional truths and authentic human experiences. Yeah, so if you haven't gathered already, my whole thing is kind of about historical fiction and film, how it does educate people and it can have the power to portray powerful historical interpretations, just like any non-fiction historian could do. Like, the same thing is happening, just in a different medium, in my opinion. Also, that whether you like it or not, people do take information from fiction books. Like, people do learn from them, and they can learn the wrong things. Just like a non-fiction book that gets it wrong, a fiction book can also get it wrong. But I feel like something interesting he says is the emotional truths and authentic human experiences. Because yeah, like, that is what fiction does. And that is what historical fiction can do about the past. And those emotional truths can be historical interpretations. But I feel like John Boyne is not talking about historical interpretation here. I get an impression he's like, I have some sort of wisdom that I impart on you with my novel. And this is something that non-fiction cannot do. You can only get it from my lovely literary novel. And it's kind of like John Boyne's emotional themes and his construction of his novel, that's more important than any sort of historical information he can convey. Acting as if these two things are completely separate and they're not reliant on each other. So yeah, this got me thinking, like, what does this book contribute? Literally, like, why was it written? I mean, I've given my theory about why it was written, but you don't have to agree with that one. When it comes to what this book set out to do, which was to ask the question, what does it mean to take accountability? But to be honest, like, I don't think I really gained anything from it. Like, I had the same understanding of this theme at the beginning as I did at the end. So at the beginning, I thought, well, Gretel was a 12-year-old child at the time, did not actively participate in what happened, and therefore is not really to blame. At the end of the book, I believe that Gretel was a 12-year-old child who did not take an active role in what happened and is not really to blame. It's quite an easy interpretation to make. And I feel like that kind of like ruins the sort of question here, because every time Gretel comes up against something from her past, thinking that she needs to take accountability, you're kind of on her side because you're thinking, well, she was a child at the time. She's the main character. She's sort of in the right. You're supposed to root for her until she murders someone. I'm like, what is this? I don't know. And the same is true when it comes to how this book contributes to the genre of historical fiction. Is it saying anything new about the history? Not really, because it's two timelines, not actually that much of it takes place in the history, which is good, because it means that John Boyne has less opportunity to mess up. That is one good thing about this novel. He's not doing anything really new with the history, he's just sort of evading it, being like, the first one's a fable, this one is about how I'm not accountable for my actions, and I will funnel that through Gretel. And I'm like, what is this? Ugh. Just, like I said, bemusing and frustrating. I think this is the first book that I read that mentions furlough, COVID and lockdown and social distancing, so I don't really have anything to interpret about that. I just thought it was kind of weird and interesting and kind of depressing. It didn't really help my general lack of enjoyment of this book.